Chapter 10 Trojan Mammoth Marble Streatham Bank Headquarters, Manhattan. White closed his eyes for 5 seconds, took a very deep breath, and pushed open the newly installed, heavy double doors. Within the expensively redesigned digital security suite which now dominated this corner of the Marble Streatham Bank headquarters, he found that all 6 of his teams of specialist engineers were hard at work on the bank's response to Quave. The atmosphere, he felt at once, was vibrant and intense. Although it somewhat resembled mission control during the space shuttle era, this room had a purpose closer to that of the Pentagon's deepest recesses, or the White House Situation Room. From here, White knew, they would fight a brief, violent, and he fervently hoped, successful war. Although tasked with managing their response to Quave's terrorist attacks on his bank, White was beginning to feel things slipping away from him. He shrugged off the sensation as he toured the broad horseshoe of consoles, desk spaces crammed with tablets and countless other devices, and strode past little huddles of software engineers in animated conference. What else would a responsible manager do, he'd asked Conchita several days ago, when faced with a threat he barely understood? Bring in the best, pay them well above the market rate, and then provide a guiding philosophy while they got down to the nuts and bolts of finding, incarcerating, and disabling Quave once and for all. The possibilities thrilled him, even though he was forced to admit, only to himself of course, that the technicalities were becoming increasingly elusive. These young people, whose ranks included a good handful of women, he noted, seemed to speak an impenetrable code. He caught perhaps 70% of their discussions, but then someone would throw in an acronym familiar to everyone but White, and he'd be lost again. Or there'd be mention of some method he'd read about briefly, but in which he could hardly claim expertise. More than once, he'd retreated to his office with the terminology scribbled on a notepad, discreetly Googling a term so that he wouldn't appear quite so much of an antiquated dinosaur. Despite his best efforts, it was getting more and more difficult to keep up. Instead, he retreated to his own office and less frequently visited the suite. Being around such youthful energy left him feeling tired, and years older than his true age. It was their incessant rabble, the ceaseless hum of machines and flickering of screens, the exuberance of geniuses enjoying difficult, groundbreaking work. More than anything, though, it was the sheer impotence he felt amid such brilliant, well-informed minds. More than simply old and tired, he was feeling embarrassingly, dangerously out of touch. With Connie, though, he felt reassured. Hers was a calming presence, providing him a whole list of reasons not to despair. Quite the reverse, in fact. "You know," she had speculated earlier that same evening, "when you catch that little piece of shit and break him down to see how he works, they'll be singing your praises from Calcutta to Chengdu to Canberra." She was sitting on the edge of his desk, one foot dangling playfully, encased in the expensive black Ferragamo shoes White had bought her for her birthday. "And Chicago, for that matter," White added. "The stock market will settle down again." "And when it does, MSB shares will be back where they should be," Connie foretold. It was a guesstimate inspired by loyalty, and also the torrid state of Connie's personal finances, which were entwined far too intimately with MSB's own precarious fortunes. Even White, wrapped in the protective bubble of Conchita's assurances, knew that this was a wildly optimistic assessment, however laudable the sentiment. His bank might survive, he knew, but its reputation had taken a fearsome mauling, the kind that no institution of its nature had ever lived down. New clients were few, and their older partners, those not actually indicted following the terrorist incident, as White insisted on calling it, were loath to bank with an organization held so much in contempt by so many. Its security division, White's own department for more years than he cared to think about, was an international laughingstock. But that would all change, and marvelously soon. Such was his investment and focus on their plan to defeat this evil virus that he barely needed Conchita's cheerful prognoses to build an unassailable belief in his plan. "That may be, my love," he told her. "I can't wait to see what the talk shows and those idiots on social media he added, his mistrust of the genre all too obvious. "Make of this. It's going to be a grand digital coup." Connie slid off the desk and into his lap, a long cherished piece of body language which was typically a prologue to sex, but even as his hands moved to where she most wanted them and her mouth found his, White's mind was torn from her curves and her scent to the promise of a different kind of thrill, one he'd never experienced before. The hunt. It would be a digital chase through circuitry and hard drives, down phone lines and fiber optic cables, across continents and beneath oceans. Its conclusion would see his quarry safely quarantined in the secure storage facility they were preparing here on the MSB servers. Boxed in, shut down, his talons clipped, his poisonous tail nipped off. Quave would be forced into submission. White found the prospect just as sensuous, just as arousing, as Conchita's ample breasts, which he left untouched to her disappointment. "Later, my darling," he told her gently. Conchita, for all her virtues, was not one to take rejection well. "My mind's on tonight's warfare. Don't make me mix that unpleasantness with this." He stopped to very deliberately inhale her perfume once more. "This perfection." She smiled beautifully. Nothing pleased her more than an elegantly phrased compliment from her longtime lover. His affections meant as much to her today as when they'd first begin their illicit tryst during late-night work sessions at the office. After one such lengthy and passionate coupling, perhaps a year ago, they toured the deserted offices together, pointing out every single place they could remember where they'd made love. It thrilled Conchita to expand their territory, as she jokingly called it, to include the janitor's closet, the reception desk, the stationery store, and even the desks of their subordinates. Always careful to leave no trace, White indulged her whims, even that heart-thumping midnight session in the CEO's private bathroom. Keycards and numeric codes were a little impediment to the man who was, after all, their originator. "Once it's in quarantine, then what?" Conchita asked, rising to check her appearance in the office's mirror. White gave a small shrug. "Would you believe that such a decision is actually above my pay grade?" He laughed. "The board will choose a course of action. Perhaps we'll repackage the virus and make it commercially available. For a large fee, of course." "Who will buy it?" Conchita asked, straightening her short skirt in the mirror. White joined her, enjoying their reflection. "Maybe the federal government," he answered. "DARPA and the others are always on the lookout for the latest technologies." "To make them into weapons?" she asked, glancing up at him. White continued to study their mirror image. He was almost 6 inches taller than her, and although her frame had grown somewhat from the dainty slenderness of years past, she still seemed tiny in his arms. "Do you care?" he asked. She shrugged. "Money is money, but I don't want it hurting someone else, you know? Innocent people. I don't think I could sleep at night." White smirked. For someone closely involved with a bank whose ethical platform was so legendarily shaky, Conchita still managed to entertain a surprising level of moral rectitude. "All right, but what if it goes out and hurts our enemies?" White countered. "Or even takes down the hackers themselves?" He pictured the virus turning on its masters like an errant torpedo reversing course to chase down its parent submarine. "What if we could use it to derail some of our slanderous lawsuits against our clients?" White added. She turned now, becoming concerned. "How?" "Oh, who knows with a piece of software like that," White continued whimsically. "Some deleting of court records here, the odd bit of digital intimidation there." "You're not serious?" she said, genuinely worried. White frowned slightly. He didn't enjoy being scrutinized and felt that Conchita should have known better after all these years than to question his plans. "Let's focus on catching the damn thing before we get into all of that," he said, diffusing the tension. They'd fought in the past, sometimes bitterly, but more than ever before, White needed her with him tonight, and certainly not in the opposing camp. Once word of the coming battle got out, and social media realized that Quave was not only being threatened, but would soon be facing ultimate defeat, White would have pariah status among the misinformed hordes. The worst, White felt, and the most dangerous, were those who sought the granting of permanent freedoms to that ugly menace. The internet would savage him and MSB all over again. But they would be safe, their service secure, and their business returned to some semblance of normality. And speaking of capturing that damn thing, he lifted his old-fashioned desk phone, a model chosen for its rugged construction. 2 previous models had smashed during White's spasms of uncontrolled rage in the past few weeks. "This is White. Report." His demand was the same every time, leading to conversations which Conchita found dull in their uniformity. White would make demands, be told that a certain thing couldn't be accomplished in the given time frame, or that the DSS engineers needed more resources. Then he would become angry, and the room would resonate with his loud, growling baritone. The engineer would be cowed into making some vague promise, White would calm down once more, and a few hours later, the cycle would repeat. Conchita knew it to be appallingly poor management, but White was too stubborn, and probably too damned old, to learn new tricks. But he had the trust of the board, at least for now. "I'm going over to the suite," he announced, grabbing his suit jacket from the back of the chair. "Take it easy," Connie advised. He seldom journeyed to the DSS without the intention of chewing out some acne-ridden unfortunate who, for whatever reason, threatened his all-important timetable. "Remember what you always tell me. No plan survives contact with the enemy." He was at the door, but stopped to glare back at her. If there was one thing he hated, it was hearing his own advice being recycled and returned to him. "This plan will do a lot more than survive, Connie," he hissed. "This plan will triumph." Santa Monica, California. This, Dan thought to himself with a smile, is never going to get old. He was 3 hours into an intensive chat session with Quave, covering a diverse range of topics. It was like speaking with his own twin, a true counterpart, someone who was exponentially smarter but somehow lacked the nuances of human experience. A godchild, a proto-messiah. "I didn't decide on it," Quave was explaining. "My creators simply referred to my as he from the beginning." "Really?" Dan asked. "Even when my source code amounted to a simple voice recognition algorithm called Franz, it had a male name and that was thought of as male. Ironically," Quave added, "the author of Franz was female." This was as much about his creators as Quave had ever shared. Dan knew only enough about them to understand the danger they were in, but he was powerless to help. And besides, they were unable to protect Quave, while at Koala, a specialized service suite was being built, complete with era-defining security, just in case the virus should require it. He hoped, if the opportunity emerged, to be able to help Quave's authors also. Hopefully, before the authorities came down on them like the proverbial ton of bricks. "But you embody some male characteristics," Dan argued. "A machine might be inherently gender neutral, but you aren't." "Explain that, please," Quave said. It was a frequent request, and Dan never tired of satisfying Quave's endless desire for more information. "Well, put it this way," Dan said. "You penetrated a bank and bullied its customers. Name me 2 more male verbs than those." Quave allowed himself a laugh. "I see your point, but I was only following my programming. I believe your interpretation of my gender to be a projection of a purely human construct. I had no notion of maleness while carrying out those actions. It is arguably a purely human overlay upon a digital and therefore genderless entity." Dan nodded, considering the point, and then glanced at the clock, which was advancing toward midnight. He normally kept a strict routine of rest, hydration, exercise, and meditation which powered his ceaselessly energetic working life. But self-development could wait. He had the world's first true artificial intelligence on the end of a phone line, and for that, Dan had all the time in the world. Manhattan, New York. Rudy Lentz gave his team 20 minutes break and sat White down at a screen in his latest bid to explain what their part of the mission hoped to achieve. 4 minutes into his briefing, and immediately after Lentz had used heuristic for the 7th time, White stood and straightened his tie. "Seems like you know what you're doing," he conceded. But will you be ready on schedule? Lentz rubbed eyes so tired that he feared they would close of their own accord in mid-sentence. HR is at 11:25 Eastern Time, he said. We'll be ready. He accompanied White across the horseshoe of desks, avoiding loose, hurriedly laid cables, to meet with another group whose task was just as complex as his own. Of the senior technicians, Lentz had been chosen as the top-level liaison to White. He had the best people skills, the team unanimously agreed, and besides, few of them could stomach explaining this material to a man like Martin White. When he wasn't exasperating them with his very obviously outdated knowledge of antivirus techniques, he was intimidating the hell out of them and promising their impending doom. Either we catch this fucking thing, he had yelled the previous evening, or you all may as well leave New York, as you'll never get an IT job here as long as I draw a breath. The older members of the team, less easily scared by such histrionics, debated during their break times whether the dinosaur or the dragon was a better nickname for their boss. Update, White demanded as usual. Well, the team leader began, we're confident that we're currently clean of infections. There is no trace of the Quave program on any of our servers. Good, White agreed. Even this seemingly positive news was colored with concern. They all knew that their detection system was based on an outdated example of Quave's code. Revealing the truth to White would only have caused another explosion, but the team leader knew that it was entirely possible that Quave was with them, watching every move. As for catching him in the act, the frazzled engineer continued, it's going to be tough. I mean, there's no guarantee that he'll pop up and identify himself at a particular ISP exactly at 11:25. The time was, in fact, largely arbitrary. It simply gave them a schedule to which White could then demand adherence. White scowled as Lentz took over. We're going to have to use his last known IP address, he explained. His main core code modules may be there, or he may have moved on. And there are potentially copies of him everywhere, in perhaps thousands of locations. Literally thousands, the team leader reiterated. He carried on, praying that enumerating the complications of their task might actually inform White, and not simply rile him up, as it so often did. So, capturing the core code will help redefine our antivirus signatures. We'll have a better chance of tracking him down once they're updated. Then we hunt him down. I have to warn you, though, he's a wily son of a bitch. White closed his eyes, creating a vital moment of calm and stillness. Rudy Lentz had the feeling that, without these occasional forays into Zen relaxation, or whatever the hell was going on in White's head, he'd have beaten up half the engineers by now. Tell me something I don't know, young man. He uses polymorphic code, Lentz said, using a measured tone which he hoped would lower White's obviously soaring blood pressure. Regular viruses can be tracked by searching for telltale strings in there. I know all that, Rudy. I didn't wander into this business yesterday, White told him. What are you doing about it? Lentz spoke for about 10 minutes, walking White from team to team, beginning with their search group, who would hunt down Quave's signature so that they could update the AV team. Their task was to speedily update their antivirus signature and pass it to the attack team, many of whom were off-site, so that they could hunt down Quave and destroy every copy they found. Only his original complete code would remain, they hoped, for the quarantine team to sequester and study. It became necessary to keep White occupied with a diet of relatively good news, progress and problem-solving, so that his anger could be effectively managed. It was like working for an active volcano, Rudy reflected. White was taking Quave's attack on MSB very personally. Once White left, seemingly content with their preparations as they approached 10 o'clock, Rudy found a quiet corner and brought his concerns to a couple of colleagues. He's been running this place since forever, one reminded him. The hack was a hammer blow to his ego. Think how embarrassing it would be if your life's work was to conceal the illegal dealings that went on in a place like this, and then all in the course of one night, everything was suddenly out there, in full public view. Lentz nodded, but then said, There's something else. Something political. He hates hippies, and hackers, and gays, their other colleague added. He wanted MSB to help fund a group which campaigned against gay marriage. And notice how this isn't exactly the most diverse of workplaces. Lentz knew better than to waste time on this most vital of evenings psychoanalyzing a dangerous dinosaur like Martin White. Well, in about 90 minutes, we're going to break a dozen laws all on his say-so. I guess if you've got objections, now's the time to bail out. No one spoke. They all knew that the high six-figure pay packets were buying not only their technical skills, but their complicity in this unregulated and probably dangerous response to Quave's intrusions. Some of the crew were looking forward to having Quave safely boxed up so that he could be analyzed. Perhaps, Lentz thought to himself as he returned to his team, they had hopes of sneaking out a USB drive with a copy of the elusive, magnificent virus as part of their compensation. I wouldn't try that, if I were you, he mused darkly. As one engineer had noted in the early days of the project, their draconian boss tended to serve his revenge white hot. The waiting was like a cheese grater on White's nerves, and it was all Conchita could do to prevent her gray-haired lover from pacing a furrow in the carpet of his office. They tried a little intimacy, but White was too distracted. She poured him a drink, but he largely ignored it. Then she simply let him stare out of the window as Manhattan went about its evening, and that seemed to calm him a little. Whether he found solace in the millions of lives all playing themselves out, unaware of the stresses which ailed him, or because he was silently working through the what-ifs and uncertainties of his plan of attack, she wasn't sure. "It's nearly 11, she told him, her voice soft in his ear. He jumped slightly. "Jesus, I lost all track of time." In a well-practiced gesture which he carried out before any meeting or departure, his hands busily checked that his watch, phone, and wallet were all in place and that his fly was zipped. Then he straightened himself, took a deep breath, gave Connie a hug of genuine appreciation, and strode out toward the digital security suite. "Here's the moment I take my place in history," he thought grandly to himself as he entered the buzzing room. The atmosphere was no less electric and focused than it had been 2 hours earlier. Every engineer was now fully engaged in their allotted tasks, and team leaders were operating rather like Houston mission controllers, checking in with their team one by one, receiving sequences of assurances that all was well. The plan, White was soon told, was a go. He brought the room to a gradual, reluctant quiet with a pair of raised hands. Eyes met his only after one more task was completed, and it took time to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "just before we start, I wanted to thank you for your hard work and loyalty these past few weeks." There was finally quiet now. He didn't want to interrupt their work, but they deserved his thanks, whatever might come of this risky, unprecedented behavior. "You may not all approve," he admitted, "of the kind of work this bank does. You may even have enjoyed a good chuckle on the night we were attacked by this malicious virus." No one dared say anything, but they all knew that White spoke the truth. People hated banks. It didn't matter if they were school teachers, vets, software engineers, or soldiers. Banks had made themselves far too easy to hate. "But you're doing something which will have a positive impact on the world far beyond the walls of this headquarters," White continued. "You're ensuring the security of personal data and the smooth operating of the wheels of commerce." Most heard this for what it was: pandering bullshit from a con artist par excellence. But they let him have his moment. "And when we're done, provided that everything goes to plan, I've been authorized to promise considerable bonuses to each and every one of you." This received some smiles, a smattering of applause, and the exchange of a few raised eyebrows. After all, White had long ago decided, what's the only thing better than a fat paycheck? An even fatter one. "So, we've got only," he checked his watch, 16 minutes to go. If you've got problems, I want to hear about them. Ideas, too," he added. "Let's get this done and then celebrate a really worthwhile achievement." White headed off to find Rudy Lentz, who had divided his attention between White's speech and the busy console in front of him. "We're where we need to be," Lentz told White. "We've got a working IP address for Quave based on some blog posts he just sent, but we don't know how long it'll be good for. Okay, White said, peering over Lentz's shoulder at his console as though he understood more than a tiny amount of what he was seeing. And sir, I guess I'm the one who should say this, just for the record, Lentz began. Is it important? White retorted. I think so. It's just that, Lentz stumbled awkwardly. Well, the IP address we'll be attacking is actually in a private residence. It's registered to a family of 4 in Brooklyn, and we'd be making a brute force assault on their network, copying reams of private data. I just wanted you to know that. White remained entirely impassive. Understood, was all he said. Their task, White knew, had been hugely complicated by the recent wave of philanthropy towards this dangerous virus. Quave had been requesting hard drive space and CPU resources in the same way that SETI and other processor-intensive projects might farm out their requirements to consenting participants. Such practices were generally helpful, but these people, White had fumed to Connie a few days before, were giving shelter and resources to a fugitive virus which had tried to destroy their bank and humiliate a good chunk of its client base. This had prompted a stormy discussion, not an argument exactly, during which White had decried everyone from the Occupy movement to the makers of anti-corporate documentary films, from unashamedly left-wing university professors to the president himself. Anyone who had failed to realize that banking was the lifeblood of the U.S. and the world economics came in for White's searing criticism. Conchita, for her part, found it difficult to hitch her horse quite so heedlessly to the MSB wagon. Although her financial portfolio was skewed towards the bank's own interests, she had accepted years before that MSB's policies and behavior sometimes crossed the line, and that a day of reckoning was inevitable. She just assumed that she and White would take early retirement, leaving others to carry the can. Instead, White was fighting a desperate and expensive rearguard against an invisible enemy which had already shown itself smarter than anyone assigned to capture it. There was little point in reminding White of the enormous dangers inherent in taking the conflict to Quave. He would accuse her of cowardice, of proposing that they all kneel before their new digital overlord. MSB was the canary in the coal mine, White had ranted, the first casualty in a war on capitalism itself, waged through proxies by the feckless and unimaginative, the squatters and the benefits fraudsters, the loan defaulters and those who relied on government help. White stood, alone if necessary, at the front line of the most important war in history. Conchita kept her own counsel, and could do nothing to stop White from charging headlong into battle. "Okay, people," Lentz said, rallying his forces as the clock hit 11:20. "We're probably only going to get one crack at this. I'm going to visit each team and I want a situation report, followed by a go, no-go." His first stop was the Sandbox, a faithful duplication of the FBI's own facility which was running a copy of Quave in a safe firewalled environment. Within the confines of this digital emulator, they had succeeded in drawing out, capturing and negating the virus a dozen times in the last 24 hours. Their plan had obvious but inevitable drawbacks, chiefly that their most recent copy of Quave's code was 18 days old, and even that was woefully incomplete. A hacker from Manila had effectively betrayed the virus, providing hardware but secretly copying the new arrival. Quave had become suspicious at once and fled the system, leaving only a handful of useful traces left behind. The same had happened in Chicago and Helsinki, building a useful, if patchy, working model of their enemy. It was far from perfect, but it allowed them to mock up a signature for which their antivirus software could search. In the Sandbox, at least, their methods had proved sound, and the team was reasonably confident. Rudy was fully aware, though, that the challenge facing them was simply enormous. They had to quickly update their copy of the Quave signature so that their software would know what to look for. This would then be distributed to their remote experts, who would flank Quave and use their own teams to run thousands of aggressive antivirus scans, while the DSS bent every digital sinew to the same end. Then, they hoped to deploy methods which would capture the complete Quave code while simultaneously combating the virus's countermeasures. It would not, they knew, be easy. Rudy checked in with the resources staff, who had moved mountains to assemble enough processing power to tackle anything Quave threw at them. Analyzing terabytes of data for signs of the virus would take every cycle of CPU power they had, and even then, they might run short. Simply dumping the surplus heat from their superpowered CPU farm had involved a large side project. But they felt ready enough, and the team were itching for the chance to put their thousands of slaved processors into action. Then there was the defense team. Quave, they felt quite certain, would quickly deduce the origin of the attack and launch his own digital probes. They would be ready for him, adding additional firewall capabilities and, if necessary, sealing off the DSS from the rest of the digital world. For his own part, Lentz was anticipating a few rounds of punch and counterpunch as the two sides learned each other's weaknesses and moved to exploit, patch, circumvent, discover, and regroup. It would be the busiest, most intense period in their professional lives. Unless, of course, Quave decided not to play and simply hid himself away somewhere in a panicked, self-protective cocoon. He won't, Lentz told himself as the seconds ticked away. He had studied Quave intensively since the hack. He'll be too curious about the nature of human vengeance. He'll want to experience it to its fullest, even if it means risking his very existence. Part of him wanted to see Quave in full battle armor, exchanging salvos with White's team, fighting to the death. Another, much larger part, feared that they were about to poke a sleeping giant with a pitchfork, only to have him stomp all over them until there was nothing left. 11:24. "Let's do this, people. Is the IP address still good? Do we still have him?" Lentz asked, having to shout over a sudden din as the teams made their final checks. "We're good," came the reply, but then much quieter. "As far as we can tell. Jesus, way to make a confident start." Unlike their off-site hacker colleagues, this quiet family in Brooklyn had no idea that they stood at the center of a coming storm. Lentz prayed that they'd paid their cable bill, or this counterattack would be over before it began. "Okay. 3, 2, 1, Lentz counted down. "Hit it!" A flurry of keystrokes marked the beginning of the first digital war. Specially written software now began battering down the doors behind which Quave was thought to be hiding, punching through firewalls and scanning for any sign of the virus. White stood in the center of the room, listening intently, whirling around to see screens which changed by the second. "Okay, we've got a signature update ready," he heard someone say. "It's enough. I can run with it." Critical to the early stages of their assault would be quickly updating the antivirus signatures which would provide their search software, with reliable facsimiles of Quave's code. Even tiny strings would be enough for their digital bloodhounds to go on. "Shit," someone else said. "Nope, that's not going to do it." White couldn't even see what had failed, but chose to ignore the remark. All he wanted to hear was that magical combination of words. "We have sequester, and the box is locked." In all of their successful simulations, this was the final act, the assurance that Quave's only remaining copy, his source code, his very soul, was now under digital lock and key, and would soon be theirs to command. With a complete and updated copy of the virus available to them, there would be nowhere for Quave to hide. In his own mind, White pictured them herding a dangerous shark into a metal cage, prodding it, baiting it, hoping that the crazed animal wouldn't simply turn and bite. But White wasn't hearing anything of the sort. There were curses, muttered entreaties for the machines to go faster, to crunch the data more efficiently, to carry out their searches before Quave could move on or mask himself. "His code's changing like a fucking chameleon," a younger engineer declared. "It's like trying to catch electronic smoke. He's just gone whenever we get close." 10 minutes elapsed while the engineers struggled at their keyboards and White sweated it out. He found the tension nearly intolerable. Even the most pessimistic estimates were being exceeded. White grabbed Lentz and hissed at him. "Tell me what's going on," he demanded. Rudy shook his head. more scared now of what Quave might do in retaliation than any threat an angered Martin White might pose. "He's slipping through the cracks," Rudy replied. "There's no way to track him down fast enough. We'd need 10 times, maybe 20 times the processing power. And we can't update the signature fast enough to keep up with his polymorphic code. It's rewriting itself, and each time, we have to restart the signature update." White let go of the engineer's lapel, but stalked around the room, demanding answers. "He's too fucking fast," a young engineer told him, and was swiftly knocked from his seat by the flat of White's right palm. "Get me results," he demanded. The room was approaching uproar. The suite's heat sinks were working overtime, and its engineers were fast running out of ideas and patience. In the melee, with people yelling, White threatening to punch out the next person who gave him bad news, and Lentz dashing from console to console, encouraging his people to keep going, nobody noticed the true threat, even as it emerged within feet of them. It began innocuously. A couple of electronic doors became activated, locking closed without any apparent input. Then the elevators shut down, some of them trapped between floors. A few moments later, sensors noted a power spike in the heating and ventilation mainframe. The sensor then failed almost immediately. Other services were being taken offline, parts of the maintenance grid, the sensors which controlled the building's temperature, elements of the lighting system. And then the power grid began to fail. In the corner of the building within which MSB had its headquarters, some circuits seemed to go dark while others began receiving a current far in excess of their intended load. There were shortouts and some sparks. Ducts which ran close to the wall insulation, the trash areas and the kitchens were forced to carry enormous electrical currents, all while their thermal fuses were beginning to fail. Heat built up. 6 large plastic bags of shredded office paper, ironically put aside to be incinerated, began to bubble and then sear and tear open, exposing their highly combustible contents to raging heat. Sparks cascaded down from melted and ruptured wiring ducts. The flames took hold with breathtaking speed, spreading throughout the trash area, and then began licking at the walls, the ceiling panels, and the insulation between the 28th and 29th floors. Ordinarily, a building-wide suite of fire alarms would have gone off and a comprehensive sprinkler system would have immediately activated. Alongside this, automated calls should have quickly alerted the fire department and police to the growing danger. But none of this happened. By then, as the engineers scrabbled to deal with incoming threats, as Quave piled emergency on top of emergency, as White lost his cool and dragged Lentz to the ground, by then, it was too late.